So you can start recording and then I'll give a little intro and I'll hand it over to you, Robert, after that.
Okay, it's recording.
Okay.
Okay, welcome to our presentation. It's called Our Minds by Robert Hastings. Robert is a new member to our group from Jamestown, Colorado. Robert, I will now hand it over to you. And can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so I live in the mountains of Boulder County, Colorado, and I'm not a scientist. And I'm interested in a lot of topics. And most of us have seen the film My Octopus Teacher on Netflix. Many of us, I hope. What a great film. So that film inspired me to study octopus evolution, anatomy, and physiology a little more. And what I came up with was fascinating from so many perspectives. And the octopus is probably the closest thing to an intelligent alien that we'll ever run into. So with that, what is intelligence? And with that, how do I get to the next? Oh, there we go. So let's see if I can minimize the things that are obscuring my slide. Okay, so how do we define and recognize intelligence? Well, for an organism to be intelligent, it has to have neurons and neurotransmitters, at least in our definition. That organism has to feel pain. And if an organism feels pain, it has some self-awareness and it has sentience, is the term that we use. Intelligence, certainly, the more intelligent an organism is, the more curiosity it displays. And it can display new behavior in new circumstances. So who doesn't have intelligence? Well, plants and insects, they really don't. Insects, it turns out, don't even really feel pain. When they get a leg pulled off, they just continue with what their program was. They don't groom the leg or anything like that. So mammals have intelligence, and some birds do too. So I'm going to lump the birds and mammals with humans in the tree of evolution. We're all pretty close, even though us humans think we're so much better. And then there's three mollusks who have intelligence: octopus, cuttlefish, and squid. And that's kind of interesting that intelligence developed a couple times in evolution. It developed in mollusks and with a similar intelligence, considering that our last common ancestor is about 500 million years ago. That's a pretty large divergence in the evolutionary tree. So we need to speak a little bit about evolution to understand how intelligence arose and how we're different from the mollusks. So there's, in evolutionary biology, convergent evolution and divergent evolution and there's parallel evolution, but these are the two big differences. So in convergent evolution, different ancestors will give rise to different species, but they'll have similar characteristics. Here you see an ichthyosaur, a reptilian, and here you see a dolphin, a mammal. So their evolution converged on the form of the fish-like form. Now in divergent evolution, you have a lot of different characteristics that come from the same common ancestor. So in this talk, we're talking about convergent evolution of intelligence in mollusks and humans. So we have to go back to for our evolutionary history to understand all of this, for me to understand it, we have to go back to single-celled organisms. So they've been around for 3.8 billion years. They're still pretty popular today. They're pretty successful. So these organisms, they can be divided about, it seems like an endless number of ways, but for our purposes here, we're going to divide them into autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs feed themselves with photosynthesis and with absorption of chemicals around them. Heterotrophs eat other things. But all organisms have the ability to signal and respond to chemical and visual stimulus. So I put visual in quotation marks here because single-cell organisms can sense light and move towards it and away from it and have different reactions. So moving right along, we'll look at multi-celled organisms. So animals have been around about 1 billion years. And the jump from a single-cell animal to a multi-cell is a big deal. A sponge is an early example of a multi-cell animal. A sponge works just fine without a nervous system, and they're our most distant relative. Nonetheless, they receive and send signals during mating, so they have that chemical stimulus response thing going on. And until about 540 million years ago, multi-cell animals were pretty unambitious. So below here, we see an animal called the Kimberella, which is an Ediacaran animal. And this is a Precambrian animal, Precambrian explosion animal. And so during that period, we say they're unambitious, and we say that because there's no evidence of half-eaten animals, no evidence of predation, that is, and they don't have hooks or claws or jaws. So then the Cambrian explosion event came along, and there's a lot of speciation in life. A lot of new species arise really quickly, and so this is about 460 million years ago. So at this time, everyone wants to get competitive and become a predator and grow teeth and claws and jaws. We don't have a good handle on why that speciation occurred, why that was such a big deal. But you see this trilobite is full of hooks and some hard shell things to protect it. We don't know if that big change on the planet came about as volcanism or a supernova or what, but it certainly happened because you see the tree of life really expand at that period. So, so then we see different evolutionary paths. When intelligent organisms come along, they really have a lot of freedom of motion. They move in a lot of different ways compared to organisms that burrow in the muck. So looking at this hypothetical chart, well, not that hypothetical, there's fossil evidence here. Looking at this chart of mollusk evolution, what we have is a Kimberella, an Ediacarian mollusk, and they start growing protective shells at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And later on, they have shells that are more divided. Now, at some point, they become able to lift off from the sea floor. And this little guy here, he scares me. I have nightmares about that thing for some reason.
I'm sorry, you say this.
So,
sorry for interrupting. You say this little guy here. I just want to point out we can't see your cursor if you're using your cursor to point to something.
Oh, I am. Oh, okay. The little guy here is the guy that is lift off from seafloor. For some reason, he looks really sinister to me. Yeah, I don't know what part of the subconscious that is. And then we have animals like the nautilus that has lots of tentacles and can grab things and has teeth. And then they really complete their takeoff with the cuttlefish and squid and octopus. So these things are really floating above the sea floor, and they're moving in 3 dimensions, and they have to develop a lot of neurons and a lot of intelligence to have that freedom of motion. So moving right along, we need, and before we get into behaviors intelligence, we need to look into anatomy and physiology. So on the octopus, we're going to look at the gross anatomy first. And so we see that they have eyes and tentacles. And on the left, we see kind of the external anatomy. They have gills, like everything in the sea has, and suckers. Internally, they have a siphon, and they're able to squirt things. They have a very curious brain that we'll get into more and more. And they, I kind of thought they didn't have an anus, but they have. And they mostly feed on crabs, on shelled creatures. And they have an esophagus that goes through their brain, and shells can sometimes lodge in the esophagus and mess their brain up, and it doesn't seem to affect them too terribly. So that's the outside of an octopus, and of course the famous 8 tentacles. So next we have the neurons in the octopus and their brain. Now neurons, it turns out, they're really fast and they're really expensive to develop. So for them to grow from their embryonic stages, that kind of development. So they're expensive to develop and they're expensive to fuel. So they really have to pay off somehow. And what we see is neuron count and brain size are loosely correlated to intelligence. So looking at some of the neuron counts in different animals, a sponge has 0 neurons, and as we said before, they've succeeded pretty well for 600 million years. And they're multicellular animals. A mollusk, like a clam, will have about 10,000 neurons. So when people say, oh, I'm happy as a clam, I doubt that clams can feel happiness because they don't have enough neurons to feel it. When you get up into a dog or an octopus, you have 500 million neurons. And a human has 100 billion. Now, a human doesn't seem 200 times more intelligent than a dog to me. So neurons don't really correlate to intelligence, but you have to have some to be intelligent. And we see that a dog on the left can play with a frisbee. On the right, the photoshopped image shows an octopus, but it isn't solving a Rubik's Cube. So they really can't do that. But what happened with the octopus is they evolved from kind of floating macaroons into predatory ghost zeppelins. When we look at octopus, and even dogs for that matter, rather than asking the question, how intelligent are they, we really should be asking is, how are they intelligent? Their ways of thinking are fundamentally so different than our ways of thinking. So that's that's a little bit about the nervous system. We're going to move on to blood. So The octopus blood is hemocyanin as opposed to our hemoglobin. So it's a copper-based blood. And it's really an ancient kind of blood, and it still works pretty well, although few organisms use it today. The octopus certainly does successfully. So the horseshoe crab is an arthropod, and it's been successful for 445 million years. One of my most fond memories is living in Key West and going out to dry Tortugas during a moonlit spring night and seeing tens of thousands of horseshoe crabs on the beach mating. And it just was one of those events that you say, oh my gosh, what is this about? And it's some ancient thing, and the smell fills the air, and I was really moved by it. So a horseshoe crab has 10 eyes, and they're a very different type of eyes than we have and other organisms have. But on the left, you see the different eyes of the animal. In the middle, you kind of see a right and left eye that makes them look a little bit sinister. However, they're completely harmless organisms. They don't bite or sting or anything. And they don't have teeth or jaws. And they have a gizzard that the birds borrowed and used pretty successfully. Now, on the right, we see horseshoe crabs being exsanguinated. And we see their blood. This blood is useful in certain pharmaceutical preparations and in medical research. So the blood is, so they don't kill the animals, by the way, when they take the blood. Most of them survive this process. But the blood is pretty useful to us to this very day. So, as we said, evolution has no goals, but it has an incredible memory. So a couple of what's called the conserved characteristics and conserved genes are retinol and opsins. So the chemicals that are needed to develop eyesight, like rhodopsin, are highly conserved. They're just all across the animal kingdom. So genes, remember, genes don't always express chemicals. Sometimes they can express form, like eyes and wings. So wings develop all the time in birds, bats, and insects. So testosterone is interesting from a developmental standpoint because it indicates a common origin in mollusks and in mammals. That's kind of interesting that testosterone and estrogen are two hormones that we share with the mollusks. But even weirder to me, this was an eye-opener. I didn't know this stuff, but even weirder, there's a plant called Arabidopsis thaliana, and it was the first fully sequenced plant genome because it's small. So this was about 20 years ago, and it took years. These days, it would take a few days. Nonetheless, it was the first sequenced plant genome. And what the gene mappers discovered, it has a gene in it called BRCA, and that tells human cells when to divide, and it also causes breast cancer. It has CFTA, which regulates chloride ion transfer in the lungs, and it can cause cystic fibrosis when it goes awry. So why do these genes occur all over the tree of life and get conserved? And I don't think that anyone can articulate a reason for it, but they can observe that it's true. Evolutionary memory is kind of amazing. So let's look next at eyes and camouflage. So an octopus is colorblind, but the opsin chemicals are found on their skin. So their eyes don't have any of the chemical that causes our eyes to sense color, but they see with their skin somehow Maybe. This is speculative even to the people who study them a lot. As we'll see, the eyes are connected to visual cortex lobes that aren't in the brain, that are really big and really computationally intensive. And we kind of don't understand how the eyes fully interact with the brain. We'll see that in some diagrams later. But the top octopus kind of looks pretty pensive, and he looks like he's staring at me, is the way that I read the picture. On the bottom, we see an octopus go into full camouflage mode. And so the skin just blends with the background. So that is another characteristic of the octopus. We'll move along to tentacles. So each tentacle has 300 suckers, and they taste. They're like little tongues. They have lots of neurons. Excuse me, they have lots of neurons in the tentacles, and they have a ganglia at the base of each tentacle, a little mini brain. So they get a lot of sensory input from chemicals in the water on those tentacles and on those little suckers. The only analog that I can think of in a mammal nervous system is the enteric nervous system, and then I'm kind of skating on thin ice. But the tentacles are semi-independent of the brain, and maybe if you thought of the fingers of a guitarist having finger memory, that might be a similar thing, that you really get muscle memory somehow. And then imagine 8 intelligent tongues around your mouth. So what I'm getting at here is that their sensorium, that the senses that they input, we're largely visual creatures, and we don't know what kind of creature. We don't know how their sensorium has, whether taste is more prominent or sight is more prominent or touch is more prominent. So on the left, we see a couple octopus from the bottom and see their tentacles and just how richly suckered they are. And on the right, I just thought that picture was cool. So when we look at the brain anatomy, we come to that diagram that I mentioned earlier. So we see a donut-shaped brain around an esophagus. And then we see these huge optic lobes. Our optic lobes are right in our brain. They're wired right in. Boy, that isn't the right term, but anyhow, our optic lobes are more closely coupled with our brain, and their optic lobes are really big, and they're loosely coupled. So looking at the diagram on the right, here we have the famous homunculus in the brain diagram, one of them. And we have a motor map and a sensory map. And we notice that our face is pretty prominent, that we really have a lot of our sensorium is there. Our intra-abdominal on the bottom right is really small, even though it takes up a big part of our physiology. Now, this diagram isn't just fanciful or artistic. So when surgeons work on human brains, when they stick little electric probes in these areas, they elicit responses of feelings in pretty precise locations around the brain that we can see in the diagram. And so now we've seen this profoundly different anatomy and physiology we can start to ask the question, what is it like to be an octopus? It's so incredibly different, as far as I can tell, that you really don't have many reference points in common. Yeah. And then we have octopus behavior in the lab. So we can start looking at behavioral questions at this point. And so when we look at an octopus in the lab, they're incredibly smart. Now, it's an unnatural environment, of course. But if you look at the octopus on the top, it's opening a jar from the outside. The jar has food in it. And if you look at the picture on the bottom, that octopus is opening a jar from the inside. And this is puzzle solving that's really pretty good, and it indicates a huge amount of intelligence. They're really good at mazes too, as you might imagine. So an octopus will squirt individual humans that they don't like, and they'll squirt light fixtures. They'll turn off lights by squirting and then escape from the tanks in the dark. So they know they're in captivity, and sometimes they don't like it. Other times they do. It's hard to tell. They have a lot of individuality. So we've seen the light squirting behaviors at two different labs, one in New Zealand, one in Germany. And obviously the octopuses in those labs didn't confer with each other and talk about it. We don't see it in all the labs. So a huge amount of variability in behavior is what we see. So other creatures we see a lot of in labs are pigeons and rats, and they don't have a lot of like new ideas. But we've observed octopus for a long time. And so some Roman DWG, that's a dead white guy, so some Roman DWG in the 3rd century observed that these creatures have mischief and craft. And so the octopus has been intelligent or recognized as being crafty for quite a long time. In the 3rd century and through most of human history, we didn't have good ways to really observe them. But now we do, and we just learn more and more amazing behaviors from them. So they get the hang of how life works in new circumstances and protest and escape. So let's look at more behavioral components to an octopus. So in Indonesia, they're observed to grab 2 coconut shells that have been cut in half with a machete and carry them around with them and use them for shelter. Remember, they're soft-bodied, and use them for shelter from predators. So obviously, people have only been using machetes for a couple hundred years, let's say. So somehow they picked up this amazing tool, and their amazing shelter tool, and they started to use it pretty quickly wherever they can find them. So that is pretty amazing. A lot of other animals make shelters, and they use compound objects, but no one else except humans with tents carry them around and assemble and disassemble them. So this to me is just an astounding behavior. And we can look at another behavior in nature, and that's socialization. So, socialization in octopus is a pretty rare thing. in general, they only get together to mate, and that's it. However, as we observe more and more octopus behavior on the seafloor, in two places we have octopolis, which is an octopus city, like metropolis. So in these octopolises, there's 2 to 15 individuals, and on the left, you see a camera catching an octopus coming up from a shell bed. So they only occur where there's a bunch of scallop shells that the octopus have put there. So we've observed 2 of these at this point. And the illustration on the right, we see an octopus kind of hiding out in the shells. And they'll get up and they'll have aggression displays, they'll have fights, and they'll play. And we don't have a clue what causes these behaviors, how these behaviors might start. Yeah, we don't have a clue of which octopus are going to be friends or not so much friends. There's just a lot of research to be done here. So then we're going to talk about how they learn things. So they do mRNA editing in minutes or days. So in the sites that molecular biologists examine, how the heck they see 50% of the sites examined have edited DNA, and mRNA is the editing device. And apparently this is how they learn things. In contrast, when you look at mammals, mRNA edits occur, I want to say 1% of the time, and they take 100 years each time that one of these edits happen. I don't know precisely, but it's on that order of magnitude. So these animals apparently are doing their learning on a molecular level, and they're doing it within the span of their lifetimes. And perhaps, and I sure don't know, but speculation here, but they're passing these edits on to their offspring molecularly. We simply don't know. Oh, so another cool thing, another thing that's remarkable about the octopus neurology and about its neurochemicals is some scientists in Israel gave MDMA to octopus, and they found that they became social. They became social animals, just like people on MDMA become all huggy. Now, perhaps this experiment shows that we should keep MDMA away from marine biologists. I don't know. And how did they do the dosing? How did they figure that out? But nonetheless, the interesting thing is that the neurotransmitters here are the same as ours, and even more amazingly, they produce the same behavioral reactions. And so all I can say is, what's with that? I just haven't a clue. So I ponder that. And in our next slide, we're going to see why it's remarkable that this learning by editing, how that ties into the life cycle. So how come they have such amazing learning and complex behaviors and they only live a year? So what do you do with all this intelligence that is going to only last a year? How did evolution want that to happen? Evolution doesn't want things. So how does that fit into evolution? We have these creatures that can learn things and have complex behaviors, and then they die. In our branch of the tree of life, creatures that have intelligence and learn things, they kind of live a long time. so the octopus is just such a short-lived creature, and we see fish that live 200 years and they're really dumb. Rockfish, they're called. So we also see other mollusks that live a long, long time. So this isn't some product of telomeres or programmed death. The biologists say that there's no reason that the octopus starts to fall apart. So this may serve some function where the big ones move on to make room for the little ones. No one really knows why this is such a short life cycle. So they can do all kinds of mimicry and complex behaviors and so forth. And I just think that octopuses are just like beautiful badasses. So I wish I could have gotten the animated GIF to run in here, but I couldn't. But we see that people pet octopuses, and the octopus apparently like and enjoy it and relate to it. We have personal relations with them, and they relate to us, these short-lived creatures. The octopus on the right just looks like such a cocky, arrogant badass, and yeah, it's, you know, where does this behavior come from? Who knows? And we know that these creatures are capable of incredible mimicry and communication, and humans can do mimicry too. So here I'm trying to relate to an octopus to inform them about the benefits of my ketogenic diet and talk their ear off. And on the right is one of my, that's called pareidolia, when you see faces and things that aren't there. So finishing up, in popular culture and science fiction, we see a lot of octopus memes all over the place. So my octopus teacher, I hope everyone has seen that, because it's just such an amazing, great nature film, an instant classic. There's also a science fiction called Arrival that, to me, captured how utterly weird these creatures are and how other they are from us. Adrian Tchaikovsky is a Arthur C. Clarke Award winner. He wrote a sci-fi called Children of Ruin about octopus. And then on children's YouTube, there's the Octonauts. Thanks, Ivan, for that. So, so finally, there's some future topics that if anyone wants to collaborate on, I would really welcome that collaboration. One of them is the enteric nervous system. Do we share evolutionary antecedents with octopus on that part of us? Another speculative topic is, what's the next step in evolution? So James Lovelock, who is famous for the Gaia hypothesis, at age 100 last year, wrote a short book on the next step in evolution, and thinks that biological evolution is all over, and the demise of humans and other biological forms is kind of done with. So not very cheerful. If anyone would like to collaborate or like to get this slide set, they certainly can email me for it. And finally, we'll close with Carl Sagan. And so life is billions of cells that are you for a while. We just have such a transient, amazing existence that all these things are cooperating for a short period to make us us. And we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And And yeah, I agree. I find it elevating and exhilarating to discover that we live in a universe that permits the evolution of molecular machines as intricate and subtle as we. And so with that, thank you. And I will stop screen sharing. And I hope you have some questions that can stymie me, because that isn't too hard.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Tom, if you can unmute everybody or allow people to unmute.
Yeah, people can unmute themselves, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. That was fascinating. It just so happens I watched Octopus Teacher last night, not knowing that you were going to talk about them in so much detail. Yeah, what a fascinating documentary. I would encourage anyone to check that out. It's on Netflix, I believe.
It is.
I don't have any other questions right now. I just wanted to make that comment. I just thought it was weird that I saw that movie last night. You talked about it.
Yeah. And so from Michael, to answer Michael Helms, hi, Michael. So marine biologists really spend huge amounts of time and effort on this. And I barely touched on octopus learning, but there are people who manage to get a paycheck out of studying this. And there's plenty of papers on it, but still it's baffling how these short-lived creatures can do so much learning in a year and have so many behaviors. So, yeah.
So Robert, were you answering Michael Helms' question there? Is that?
I was, yeah.
Okay. It looks like Harvey, did you have a question and comment?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First, I like your paradola. That was cute. Your photo. When you talk about RNA editing, it occurred to me that the short lifespan could be part of a sequence of that learning experience. That is I mean, we think of each incarnation as being the totality, and this is kind of the equivalent of the Buddhists, that it's lots of incarnations. I mean, in a sense, if the learning is actually passed on at the RNA level, that's a way of accomplishing long-term learning.
Yeah. So Harvey, to that end, maybe the octopus, maybe that does fit into the Buddhist worldview. Maybe octopus learning occurs intergenerationally, and individuality isn't that important of a thing. That it's kind of the genome that's the major component, and not the individual lifespan. Again, there's plenty of speculation that you can do on this, and that's the fun part, isn't it?
Well, yes, but going back to individuality, I mean, again, taking this Buddhist perspective, the individual would then be the sequence, not the instant. It's just like, tomorrow I wake up and I'm still me, and I have this. I'm further down the genetic line, and still this very strong connection with what I had been 20 generations ago. And that's why my learning abilities are already honed, because they're actually built on all of the previous learning experiences I've had.
Yeah.
One other comment. I lived in the UK for many years, and in the UK, well, I don't know whether it's still the case, but it used to be that people would actually, just non-scientists like yourself, would take up a particular, would cultivate a particular interest and really become expert. There was a guy at the end of the street I lived on who ran a little plumbing shop, who it turned out was one of the world's experts on Mississippi riverboats. So it's nice to see somebody somebody doing, following in that tradition, which I always admired.
Uh-huh. And I would like to give a shout out to Roland. Hello, Roland. So Roland is in Cologne and checking out the talk from there. It's midnight where he is, I think. So
Yes.
thanks for.
Yes. Hello to everybody.
And so you see Goldman is here too. You guys know each other. So anyhow.
Okay, I'm showing Michael Helm has another comment or question. He was wondering if there were some mechanisms to pass learning onto eggs.
Yeah. And that is, again, an excellent question, Michael. And I'm unaware of the reproductive cycle and of the genetics that much. That's a deep dive that I have not taken. So, it seems like that would be a productive thing to explore, and perhaps someone is.
If I
So,
may
yeah.
pipe in.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, hi. When you're asking if learning can be passed on to the eggs or the oocytes, there is no mechanism for that. The closest you get, I think you were touching on earlier, is that you can have sort of a speciatal learning passed from generation to generation. Commonly call that instinct. And then the other thing that could be passed, which I think you alluded to, was not the knowledge itself, but that your system would be set up to rapidly learn certain areas of knowledge that are important to you.
Okay.
Does anybody
And-
else
Think
have
about that
any
in terms-
questions? Does anybody else have any questions?
Hi, this is John Cairns. I'd like just to make a quick comment.
Sure.
Robert, that was wonderful. I love this kind of information. Really feel like I benefited from it. I think that one of the concepts that I could take away from this is I don't think humans have to understand the intelligence of other creatures or other species in order for them to be defined as intelligent or thought of as intelligent. And I think that that's the kind of the profound thing that we can take away. We don't have to understand any of the questions that you posed, and the intelligence is still there. It's independent of us, and that's an important thing. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And John, I would like to make a shout out to my two other friends in Chicago, Brent Leatherman and Mark Ringel. And when I'm in Chicago in September, Brent will have moved at that point, but I hope to see both of you in September when I visit. So
yeah, we'll have to stand across from each other at the train station parking lot and wave signal flags.
With our tentacles.
That's right.
So
Communication by semaphore.
Anybody else have a question?
Actually, I did right at the end there, and sadly, I didn't come in till almost there. You had the guy who was saying that biological evolution is at its end, or that was his thesis statement.
Right. James
Does
Lovelock.
he say what kind of evolution he thinks might go forward from here?
Machine, in a word. So James Lovelock is famous for the Gaia theory. He's a NASA scientist, British. And at age 100, Lovelock has done biology for a long time. And if you've heard the term Gaia hypothesis, and if you've heard the term Anthropocene, so Lovelock says the Anthropocene era in biology began 300 years ago when Watt invented the steam engine, and humans became able to use more energy than they could extract from food and horses and wind. And so that energy extraction era of the Anthropocene and of steam engines carboned up the atmosphere so perfectly that it looks like we're not going to have yeah, that certainly climate change is an existential threat to humans, and Lovelock thinks that it will crash the whole ecosystem, and that machine intelligence, in terms of the AIs that have been coming out in the last couple of years, will propel our machine descendants into interplanetary space. And
God, I hope
it's
not.
that, well, it sounds like a crock to me, but you know, the guy did do the Gaia hypothesis, so he has some credibility.
Yeah.
So
I was just hoping humans don't get off this planet. We're parasitic enough as it is. So, so what was I was thinking? There was something. Oh yes, it's stating that humans would be evolving via technology. I imagine that he's only talking about humans, since other
I'm
creatures.
sorry, Helen. Uh-huh.
So I was thinking other creatures can still evolve biologically. In fact, they kind of have to. But it makes sense that we're not, because why should we adapt when we can adapt our environment instead?
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty speculative, and it's interesting to think about. So
Well, in
so-
Homo Deus by Harari is kind of draws the same conclusion, that from here on it's the digital world that continues evolution.
yeah, and Johann Harari is pretty interesting. I'm listening to his 21 questions for the 21st century right now, and he's an interesting thinker. I enjoy his stuff.
Robert, I have a question.
Yeah.
Back to the octopus intelligence, is there anything that we would take away from this observation of their intelligence and our ability to kind of interact with them? Any kind of future relationship that you see that we would have with the octopus? I don't know, becoming more part of our life, and we becoming more part of their life and interacting more?
Yeah, and I think that that's happening. Just as we have more underwater technology and more surveillance, underwater. I understand that Amazon is going to get their shopping habits pretty soon. So it seems inevitable that at least a few of us will have more interaction with them, just because it's possible. And hey, they're friendly. You know, they so it seems like more interaction is a given to me. So yeah.
So do people have them as pets? Is that becoming kind of popular?
Oh, I hadn't thought of them in the pet. Whoops, there went my screen. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't thought of them in the pet way. How can I maximize you? Yeah, if you look around, so in my web surfing, I saw different octopus farms. As Michael says, you know, you see them in tanks at aquariums, but people do farm them. They're not a regulated or endangered species. And when you see that, I always think of the experience at the Wild Animal Sanctuary out in Keensburg, Colorado, where they find people who have been using, like, what's that, Joe Exotic, where people had relationships with the animals that were kind of abusive. And then you see relationships with the animals that aren't abusive. But octopus don't need protection. You know, they need to be in their own environment and do their own thing. But I'm Yeah, I don't know if I'd want an octopus for a pet, but what can I say? I keep cats. That's enough. So,
I had a kind of following off of Cheryl's question.
yeah.
When you I don't know if you specifically compared them, but in one of your first slides showing intelligence, they had the same amount or approximately the same amount of neurons as dogs. And you know how much of a good relationship our species has with dogs.
Yeah.
You might not have an answer for this, but could we have, I know with the documentary on Netflix, it's shown that it possibly could be, but could we have the same relationship with octopus as pets in the future as we do with dogs now because of their intelligence?
Well, from what I understand of dogs, we established a relationship with dogs 10 or 20,000 years ago. Dogs have dominance hierarchies, just like primates have. And there were tough times for dogs 20,000 years ago with an ice age. And so they started hanging with humans, and we saw a mutual benefit there. It's unclear to me whether that kind of relationship could develop. I have the feeling that octopus just don't need us, but then George, you could say that cats don't need us either. So
Right,
hell, I don't
right.
know.
Yeah, I just think I think it'd be interesting, in in the future. And when I say the future, I mean like hundreds of years from now, when we eventually, this will be in the time to where we have built up colonies on other planets, and at the same time we'll be needing more space. So I've done some research, and there's the possibility that we'll be building life like cities like in the ocean, like floating cities, and we could have an octopus as our water dog. And I don't know, I think it's interesting to think about.
It certainly is. And so if you read that book, Children of Ruin, by Adrian Tchaikovsky, the fellow who won the Arthur C. Clarke Awards. So that book and some of his other books are about that kind of relationship, where on water planets, humans have a deal with octopus to do equipment repair and mining and stuff like that. And they can move in three-dimensional outer space better than we can. And if you're familiar with David Brin's Uplift trilogy, Tchaikovsky expands on the notion of uplift. So yeah, that, I mean, there's so many things have foreshadowing in fiction, and your idea,
yeah. Could you put the name of the book series or in the chat so I can copy and paste and save it for there?
I certainly can do that. So that is to everyone.
Meanwhile, I have a comment.
Okay.
This is Mark. Oh, by the way, hi Helen. I saw her in the background.
Yeah, you did.
So there, a philosopher of consciousness named Thomas Nagel wrote a really famous paper called "What's It Like to Be a Bat?"
Yeah, and that's referenced in the book. Go on.
Yeah, and what he's getting at there is there's a distinction in at least in the philosophy of consciousness between what's called excess consciousness, which is like I know that I know this, and then phenomenal consciousness, which is I am me experiencing the color red or something. I feel that. And so he gets at that in his essay of like, what's the world like to a bat that echolocates itself? What does it feel like to be a bat? And the octopus is the creature that I feel that way about. you know, with 2/3 of your nervous system
Yeah.
outside of your brain, it's conscious, but it's in a way that is just a wonderful mystery.
Hmm. Indeed, a lot of so Mark, you might want to read Other Minds. There are 4 chapters in the book that are about philosophy and Nagel, theory of mind, embodied cognition, that I couldn't handle. They use a lot of precise philosophical terms. The author is, after all, a philosopher, and that isn't just a made-up field of study that people sit around and discuss stoned. So there's a lot of that in the book, and in
That was a
fact,
philosophy major. Who says they don't get stoned?
So yeah, so if you're into embodied cognition, which is making the rounds in that area a lot, I will send you a link to a meetup that's going to happen in 2 weeks from a group in Seattle about embodied cognition in animals and perception. I found that anatomy and physiology, behavior was really, and some evolutionary biology was enough to touch on. The philosophy just would take years to understand for me. But you might, yeah, you know that stuff already, so you have a background in it, so it might be cool.
Harvey has a question.
Oh, wait, oh yeah, I'm unmuted. There was a question, this thing about octopus and interacting with others. I mean, there have been a lot of cultures that were on the seacoast. And I mean, one would have thought that there would be anecdotal stories about my friend the octopus and how an octopus saved my life or this and that. You don't hear very much of that. So your comment that, as you say, the octopus might not need us very much might be right.
Yeah.
I had another, what was my question? I made it. Oh yeah, I also thought about, God help us, the octopus being used by the military, because when they do things like that.
Well, the octopus, anyway, the octopus wouldn't make that great of a recruit, I think. However, back to anecdotes about octopus. Yeah, that Roman guy in the 3rd century had anecdotes about it. One of the things in the film, My Octopus Teacher, that I felt was, probably it's just me, but I felt that the guy who presented it kind of made it feel like he was the first person who had ever done this stuff.
Yes, that's what I was alluding to, that go on, sorry.
Yeah, and when you, so I've spoken with people on the coasts who have worked at aquariums and known marine biologists, and a friend from Scripps Institute. I said, yeah, that stuff happens all the time. However, that guy was a great photographer and he told a great story. But yeah, I felt he kind of didn't, he could have put some context there. But anyway, it was a great film. So
I think the main character in The Octopus Teacher, we were talking about, you know, can we have a relationship with them? When at the end of the movie, I won't, you know, spoil it for anybody, but he felt that what he experienced with the octopus was really affecting him and what he was going through in his life. And as the title says, the word teacher, I think he felt like the octopus actually taught him something about his own life. So that was something that he got from the octopus.
Right. Yeah, it's funny thing about this thing about the spoiler, but I don't know if many people have, but I think a lot of people read books the second time and they enjoy them the second time. So this idea of a spoiler, I mean, in a way, I think when you know the end, you're much more present in the beginning. You're not just always, or as you read it, because you're not just looking for what's happening next. You're actually reading what's there now. Anyway, to Robert, this was certainly an enjoyable presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, Mike, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's interesting. You were talking about the Gaia hypothesis earlier, which I kind of subscribe to. One of the things that's been brought up is, since Gaia is sort of an evolutionary entity, people think that the current global warming may actually be a response to us bothersome humans that are making such a mess of things. And somebody also connected the recent COVID-19 pandemic, because we humans apparently lit that out by digging so damn far in the jungle that we discovered ecosystems with viruses in them that we otherwise wouldn't have found.
Yeah. So with respect to COVID, a woman named Laurie Garrett, who was a public health person and epidemiologist, 20 years ago wrote a book called The Coming Plague. And she pointed out that with the deterioration of public health systems, and that's real distinct from medical systems, which are also deteriorating, but as the public health systems got defunded and we caused more disruption in ecosystems, that different organisms would take prominence. And sure enough, Laurie Garrett was on Democracy Now! A couple of weeks ago, so they dredged her up from wherever she was and had her restate her observations, and it was it was really kind of interesting. So what you're saying was not just Gaia hypothesis, but it was predicted by public health folks. So for what that's worth.
Robert, can you explain what the Gaia hypothesis is?
Oh, sure. So the Gaia hypothesis is the hypothesis that life on Earth has, not life on Earth, that the geology of Earth and weather systems are mediated by the reactions of life. So Lovelock ran into this notion when he was studying how to detect life on Mars. And he said, well, how would you detect life? And he said, well, you'd see a bunch of carbon dioxide, you'd see an atmosphere change from, I want to say a cyanide atmosphere to an oxygen atmosphere. And when it turned to an oxygen atmosphere, a lot of organisms went extinct. So the notion is that life influences and changes geology, and that there's a feedback mechanism that becomes pretty involved with homeostasis in the biosphere / geological sphere. And it was pretty controversial for a long time. And he and a woman named Lynn Margulis were the expositors of this theory. And now just like I think Harvey said, a lot of people subscribe to it. But it's a hypothesis. It's not a law. Anyway, James Lovelock is pretty cool because he's kicking out books at age 100. And it just, that gives me some hope that some of us will be intellectually active when we grow older. So, yeah.
And I was
Harvey,
just
do you,
gonna put
Harvey,
in,
do you, I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna put in addition to what he said, the kind of short version, and I can't remember if it was Lovelock who said it, but is basically think of the planet itself as a living organism.
Oh,
When
yeah.
you see it change and respond to things, you see it, what's going on there, that it's evolving in a sense.
Harvey, you had a question?
Yes. First, there was somebody in England about 4 years ago, I think, who wrote a book, My First 100 Years. So that's relevant to your comment about people staying active. He did die the next year. The thing, but still, I mean, the fact that he was, you know, like I'm pretty diligent about exercising. I do 100 miles a week on a bicycle. And people, you know, the idea that it might help me live longer is not nearly as motivating as the fact that while I'm still alive, I'll be fully alive. So there can be different reasons to, you know, to be pleased about things like that. This thing with Gaia, I think, is that there's one thing that I'm a scientist, my background's in physics, I sort of object to, and that is that there's the idea that Gaia is now a kind of conscious entity doing these things. And if you look at economic systems, I know when the Russians came, I think in Khrushchev's time, they were astonished at how effective the whole capitalist system was. And there's not a conscious evolution or sort of a conscious control of everything. It's that all of these complex interactions work so self-regulatory, and such a self-regulatory way that they do an amazing job of regulating. And I think that in a similar way, all of the organisms of the planet interact with each other and with the weather systems and with all of that, and produce an effective system that really is brilliantly self-regulating, but not that it's a conscious entity. Thanks.
Okay. So I would like to give some special shout outs